when Mark was here this week, he commented particularly on three aspects of St. Mary's. The first thing he said was about our music last week. He said it was spectacular, and he's been around a lot, like around the world, and he said our music is spectacular. I'm glad he said that, because I'm using that as a way of saying next week I'm giving Marie the Sunday off. She's been working really hard, and particularly after second week of camp. She's, like I said, she can have the whole morning off, but Annie's got a soccer game, so she's going to come to church after the soccer game, maybe play a few at the end. But I think it's perfectly legitimate after all she's done. The second thing he said was about the sermon last week, which I found very flattering. He thought it was a very good message and very timely. And the third thing he commented on was the welcome that he received here, and just the vibe of the church. And he said that he can understand why St. Mary's is drawing. It's a place that draws you in. I thought those were three good comments for him to make. The sermon this morning follows on from last week. I'm not going to re-preach last week's sermon, but what I would like to do is just recap. It was about the parable of the Good Samaritan, and we all know that story. As I said, we've drawn pictures of it in Sunday school. We've talked about it. It's used in both sacred and secular circumstances to describe organizations, to describe appropriate and good human behavior, kindness, and all the rest of it. So I wanted to take it to a different level. And what I did, and I hope it wasn't too intellectualized, because it's supposed to be about God's grace connecting with our heart, resulting in action. Okay? But what I did was I looked at the behavior of the Samaritan in three aspects as it relates to the victim. I started by saying there was a victim. Whether or not this person had done anything to bring hardship on himself, we don't know. That's not in the story, because that's not the point of the story. But there was a victim of a robbery who was lying half dead by the side of the road. A priest comes by, who obviously hadn't checked his email that day and was in a rush to get back to the office, and passed by on the other side. A Levite came by, who obviously had some sermons to write for Sunday, and he didn't have the time to stop and take care of the person. Blessed him and moved on his way. And then a Samaritan comes by, and there's an irony in that it's called the parable of the Good Samaritan, because in Jewish understanding there was no such thing as a good Samaritan. Samaritans were by definition unclean, unkosher, and were not proper followers of God. So there was no such thing as a good Samaritan. The Samaritan did three things. The first thing he did was respond to the victim's immediate need by binding his wounds. He took care of the immediate and present need. I suggested that the church, though we always fall short, we're not bad at that. When there's a global disaster or whatever, we're decent at responding to it. The second thing he did, though, was create a structure so that the person whose wounds he bound up could come to further wholeness and wellness. He created an infrastructure of support by taking him to the inn and by paying the bill, saying, take care of this person, whatever he needs, it's on my account. And then the third thing he did was, and in order not to spend 5 minutes talking about it, he fought against systemic evil. That's worth many sermons in and of itself. But what he did was he said, on my return journey, if this person, if the tab is bigger, charge it to my account, and I'll pay you when I return on my return journey. So you got three things. One is the immediate response to crisis. The second is creating a structure so that people come to wellness, not just have a band-aid put on their wounds. And then the third thing is confront systemic evil, like saying, I will be here for the long haul. So I suggested that the church needs to learn more, particularly about the second and third aspect. Fighting against systemic evil, and also creating an infrastructure, helping to create an infrastructure where people can come to wellness and wholeness. What I want to talk about today is following up on that with a little bit of a fantasy parable. Not that I would ever put myself in Jesus' place as a raconteur. He was incredibly brilliant, but I just want to take that parable perhaps to the next step, and then make a very practical, and perhaps some of you might actually consider rather audacious, maybe even presumptuous, step forward from there. Aren't you excited to know what that's going to be? So here, let's just continue on. So the parable of the Good Samaritan finishes with him going to the innkeeper and says, here's 2 pieces of silver. It was way more than you needed to sign in for the night. But if he spends any more, if this costs any more, on my return journey, I'll top it up. I'll pay his bill. And obviously he's on a journey. So let's just create this fantasy. Where's the journey to? And this is the way my mind works. I'm not suggesting it's particularly divinely inspired, but it just goes this direction. So what was he on his way to do? In the story, there's no indication that he's part of a caravan, a merchant's caravan. And in those days, caravans traveled because it was safer that way. Very rarely did a merchant go on their own. So there's no indication that he was part of a caravan. We're not told really, except by implication, what he did for a living. He was a traveler, and so that's where the inference that he was a merchant comes from. Because not many people traveled. They stayed close to home, except as necessary. It was a dangerous world out there. How often do we hear that in our lives? And so he continues on his journey. My fantasy is that he's being invited to some dinner party hosted by his merchant friends a couple of towns over. Because let's face it, the whole of the area that Jesus walked in his life was not really much bigger than the West Island of Millborough. Like if you do it in pure distance, it wasn't a huge geographic distance. And towns tended to be pretty close to one another, close to sources of water. And towns and villages tended to be like 2, 3, maybe 5 miles apart. But we're not talking about enormous distances. Remember, it's only with the expansion of the church and the Roman Empire coming in that actually from your perspective, that part of the Mediterranean began to be known to the people of the Middle East. So let's just assume, and I'm not saying this is biblical because it's not, I said it isn't. But let's just assume he's invited to a dinner party. So he shows up at this dinner party and he's brought his chicken. Of course, he brought it alive because you don't want to kill your chicken before the dinner party because in the journey it would rot. So he brought his chicken. And so the host of the dinner party says, thanks very much, wrings its neck, and throws it in the cook. So it's going to be a barbecue. We brought chicken. Invites him in, says, sit down, relax. So he sits down, sort of reclines down, and the next thing that happens is a servant or a slave, an indentured servant, takes off his sandals and washes his feet, and washes his hands, washes his head, etc., 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 because that's what you did to extend hospitality. You had the slaves do the work. And then it's time to sit down for dinner. All the guests are there. One of the guests, who tends to be a little bit more of a mouth, looks at him and says, you are always late for dinner. You never show up on time. It's like St. Mary's on a Sunday morning. No, they wouldn't say that. You never show up on time. So what's the story this time? Oh, never mind. There's always a story. Tell us what happened this time. Did the cow give birth? It's not the calving season. What happened? Did the IRS come after you? They did have an IRS, they just didn't call it that. No, I don't want to talk about it. What is it this time? Well, I just thought about something. Don't worry about it. And so he would try to push his friends off, but eventually the story would come out. Yeah, there was this guy by the side of the road. And he was bleeding, and he looked like he was really in trouble, and I just thought you did what? Moshe, maybe his name is Moshe, maybe not. He's Spartan, so it wouldn't be Moshe. What? Give me a name. And actually, I came up with several names. I came up with names like, maybe Peter, or another Peter, or Walter, or Lorne, Daniel, Marie. Why did you do that? You are always doing these dumb things. You are so going to get in trouble someday. Was he a Jew? I don't know. I didn't stop to look, and I didn't ask. If he was a Jew, you are so in trouble, because he is going to come after you, because from now on, you're Samaritan, in case you haven't noticed. He is unclean from now on. Well, it was either unclean or dead, so maybe unclean is better than dead. But I didn't ask. He can sue you. He can take you for everything you got. Why do you always do these dumb things? Somebody else jumps in. And besides which, don't you love conversations where somebody makes an argument that's, you know, that is supposed to be dagger through the heart. And once you're bleeding all over the place, they said, and besides which, you know, man, we've all got friends like that, right? And besides which, maybe he did something to deserve that. Maybe he was a thief and a robber, and he had just done a good thieving and robbing job. And the other thieves and robbers decided that they were just going to bump him out of the gang. Just blah, 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 yeah. And so what you've done now is put yourself in the middle of a gang war. Way to go. Smart move. Don't. Why do you do this? Another person pipes up. And besides which, maybe he deserved it. Maybe he had done something. Maybe what happened was he had wrongfully taken advantage of a young woman. And this was her family getting retribution. And they were entitled to their retribution. And he should have died. And you were saving him. Fie on thee. No, that would have been Henry VIII's time. Forget the fie on thee. You shouldn't have done that, guy. Why are you always doing these things? Don't you know that you can be taken advantage of? Don't you know that when you put it out there, people can use you? And don't you know that if you do good for people, which will probably be like flushing down a toilet, well, they didn't have toilets, but anyway, flushing your money down a toilet, don't you know you're never supposed to let them know who you are? It's always supposed to be anonymous. Because if they know who you are, they will always come back for another payment. And here, you have gone to the innkeeper, oh, you good time Charlie, well, good time Moishe, and said, here, on our return journey, if there's any more into the bill, I'll pay. So now he knows who you are. And so he and all his lazy, layabout neighbors are going to be hitting on you because obviously you're rich enough to give your money to poor people who are just going to exploit you and take advantage of you, and they're not going to be a lot better off, and you're going to be a lot worse off. Way to go, Good Samaritan. Should be the parable of the good, stupid Samaritan instead, because you did a dumb thing. God has a different take on it. God has a different take on it. And of course, I've tried to be somewhat humorous. Well, it's easy to be in this kind of context. But in one way or another, I, and I'm sure you, have heard exactly what I've been saying for your whole lives as excuses for not getting involved in caring for the poor and the marginalized, the people who live on the fringes of society, the people whose needs are much greater than ours. Sometimes it's written by or spoken by sophisticated people, the intelligentsia. Sometimes it comes as a PhD thesis. Sometimes it's the banner headlines of the day. But we've all heard it. Reasons why we can justify not getting involved in the lives of the broken of the world. They don't deserve it. It's their own fault. They're lazy. They must have done something to bring this upon themselves. It has justified racism and slavery. It has justified the oppression of women. It has justified the abuse of children. It has justified the oppression of workers. And it has justified the marginalization of generations of people. It is ungodly, and it is evidence of systemic evil. God, however, as evidenced by the parable of the Good Samaritan that Jesus said, not the tardy one, as evidenced by the parables that Jesus said, does not accept excuses, no matter how sophisticated or fine-sounding they are. He mandates us to bind wounds, to provide ongoing care and comfort and support, and to fight against systemic evil wherever we find it. One of my favorite Canadian musicians, favorite Canadian musicians is Bruce Copeland. For those of you that don't know this, in his younger days, I don't know where he's at spiritually now, but Bruce Copeland used to lead a youth group in Ottawa, the Anglican youth group in the Diocese of Ottawa. A lot of his music is very spiritual, and there's profound meaning in it, but because his music is so lyrical, so much of it, there's so much that you can miss it. One of the lines, do any of you remember the song "Lovers in a Dangerous Time"? I'll just risk singing "Lovers in a Dangerous Time." You sound vaguely familiar, okay? One of the verses, or one of the lines in that song is this: "Kicking back the darkness till the light bleeds through." Kicking back the darkness till the light bleeds through. Now, Bruce Cockburn, at various points in his career, has run afoul of the sensitivities of many people, particularly for his song "If I Had a Rocket Launcher." And there's things in his songs, some of which is aggressive and sometimes violent and stuff like that, but it speaks very loudly to the human condition. And it speaks, I think he's brilliant in taking what's in good people's hearts and expressing it. And I think that line expresses what's in a lot of good people's hearts, but in that we are not perfected people. Even our caring has an edge to it. And I think he's tagging into that. Kicking back the darkness till the light, kicking at the darkness till the light bleeds through. What I'd like to suggest to you this morning is that that's what the parable of the Good Samaritan is about. It's about kicking the darkness. Without looking at who this individual was, he was a representative of suffering humanity. And his story is about that cloud of blackness that is surrounding him, this violence and this anger and hatred, wherever it came from, or why ever it was there, without defining that. And the Samaritan comes in and slices through the darkness till the light bleeds through. And what I believe is that is what the Christian church is called to do. And that is what each and every one of us is called to do. Within the skill set, the intellect, and the resources with which God has blessed each of us individually as well as collectively. God does not call us, and there's another sermon in here, so please leave this sermon unpreached today. God does not call us to be anything more than He has called us to be. It's kind of a weird sentence that's worth a sermon. But He does not call us to be anything more than He has called us to be. But what He does call us to be is people who will use whatever He has entrusted to our care as stewards of life and resources to offer those for the benefit of lost and hurting humanity. Next week, Marie gets part of a Sunday off. We're going to have a guest preacher. I love Glennis Williams from Action et Fujimoria. I love her. When we were talking on the phone this week, I said to her, the summer at St. Mary's Music Camp and the Science Camp will just be ending, and our numbers are low. So no, that doesn't matter. But she's being given another job. She's going to be moving to Toronto to head up the whole mission department of the Presbyterian Church of Canada, their national and international missions. And so she's leading Action et Fujimoria. And before leaving Montreal, she wants to come and visit us at St. Mary's. Again, most of you know, some of you may not, that a couple of years ago, the Prime's World Relief and Development Fund, in celebration of 50 years, started a project of sponsoring 50 refugee families to Canada. And our youth group, in conjunction with a small number of people from St. George, St. Anne de Bellevue, agreed to sponsor a family and brought that project to completion. Our youth group raised somewhere between $15,000 and $17,500. By far a large share of the money necessary. She wrote a letter, and I got to tell you, this is an aside, not really part of the sermon, but tell you, one of the things that you get in ministry is letters and notes from people who appreciate something, either that you've done or that your church has meant to them. I have a drawer of some wonderful, wonderful cards and letters and just thank yous from folks. And some of you see them sometimes on the bulletin board when they're addressed to the whole parish. This letter that I got, this one's either going to get framed or laminated. And it's written to the amazing youth group, St. Mary's Anglican Church, care of Reverend Lorne Tardy. I love it! It's not Lorne Tardy and his amazing youth group. I love her bits. The amazing youth group is addressed to the youth group. Very few of you are today. They're visiting friends. Caribbean. Dear Lorne and the amazing St. Mary's Youth Group, our refugee sponsorship may not have ended as we had hoped, but we were open to where God led us. Again, for those of you who don't know this, we sponsored a family to Canada. They were refugees from Iran living in Turkey. We brought them over, and they stayed from October through to April. They chose to move to British Columbia, and while we may have disagreed with their choice to make that move, it says something about Canada that certainly could not be said about Turkey or Iran, and that is that they have freedom of movement. They could choose to move to a community where there were plenty of Farsi-speaking Persians, unlike the community that they found here, not for any fault of ours, but and they could choose to get on an airplane and fly to British Columbia and resettle there, and they are resettled there. Yay, Canada. Dear Lord and the amazing St. Mary's Youth Group, our refugee sponsorship may not have ended as we had hoped, but we were open to where God led us. We were also part of a much larger Anglican movement across Canada that welcomed 50 refugee families from some of the most dangerous places in the world. 50 families that are sleeping safely each night. 50 families whose children attend school, make music, play sports. 50 families that can dare to dream of a brighter future. It was a wonderful experience for me to be part of this journey with you. I do believe that little Rowena will be blessed by what you did for the family. And the blessings continue. When the project finished, there was money left in the bank, $5,400. Thank you so much for sharing a portion of the remaining money which you raised with Action Réfugiés Montréal as we welcome refugees here in Montreal. On behalf of the staff and board of directors and the people we work with, a huge thank you for the $2,732.52. We are astounded by this gift. The Private World Relief and Development Fund got the other half. I'm closing a number of our 2011 annual reports. She is a minister of the church, which introduced a few of the refugees with whom we work. Also a DVD, which we have just produced, a 4-minute collage of photos set to Connie Caldor's song, A Mother's Prayer. We could not do this work without people in the churches who faithfully support us. I believe this ministry of hospitality and compassion is letting Christ stay because of our faith in Him. Wishing you all God's richest blessings as we enter the summertime of fun and renewal. So, there you go.
Amen.
Isn't that one of the best letters you've ever heard? So, Harold, Good Samaritan, I think Glennis has summarized it pretty nicely. Having spoken to Glennis and having received a letter from an email from the Private World Relief and Development Fund, very similar to this, I just sort of wonder where we go next. But I think as a parish and as a youth group, we're hitting on something. We're hitting on something. I feel a little in two places right now, because on the one hand, I'm speaking of the Good Samaritan and the marginalized refugees of the world, specifically, generally the marginalized, but specifically refugees, at a time when we have just had a wonderful week of music camp in upper middle class suburbia, and are about to have another one. And I'm not suggesting anything negative about that. It's wonderful. But it's like cymbals going off in cheer. Folks, the church, I really do think, means so well, and often does so good in responding to the needy. It really does. I think we're daring to ask questions about, well, what do we do to follow it up? It's not just enough to welcome people over here and give them a new start. There's got to be the follow-up, the infrastructure stuff. There's got to be the recognition as we do this ministry, Glennis calls it ministry of hospitality. What we're doing is pushing back systemic evil. We're digging through the darkness so the light can shine through. Let's keep doing it and do more. Amen. Let's pray. God, you have given us so many opportunities for service in this place. Just looking at the 60-ish kids last week and their families, singing, laughing, playing, was such a great joy. But you know the inner workings of each one of their lives. Their sorrows, their pains, their joys, their hopes, and also their shames. Please, Lord, continue to give us opportunities to welcome people in your name. We pray for the world around us, for the poor, for the marginalized, the refugees, the displaced, people who may not live to see another sunset or another dawn. Thank you for the incredible wealth that you have blessed each one of us with, for the resources that you have entrusted to our care, for the friendships, for the relationships, for all the good. Lord, we do want to be proper stewards of your treasures and your mysteries. But sometimes we've got to admit that we're a little slow to pick up on the clues. So quicken our hearts and our spirits and our minds to see and to hear where you're calling us and challenging us to push back the darkness so your light comes through. In Jesus' name we offer these prayers and all our prayers. Amen.